A trophic structure refers to the feeding relationships within the ecosystem. Within an ecosystem, there are 5 different trophic levels. They are the primary producer, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and finally, decomposers. The feeding relationships are generally viewed as a food web consisting of all the possible food chains that exist within the ecosystem. So right here in this diagram is a food web. A food web shows all the different food chains within the ecosystem. A food chain is usually linear in the sense that it contains one organism from each trophic level. If you take all the possible food chains and you link them together and show how they're interconnected, then that's a food web. A producer is an organism, such as a plant, that's able to produce its own food from inorganic substances. It's important to note, however, that not all plants are producers. And what we mean by that is not all plants produce their own food, but sometimes get their food from other sources. An example of that we can find right here in Newfoundland in the pitcher plant. The pitcher plant does not produce its own food. Instead, it acquires its food by trapping small bugs and insects into the leaves, and they trap them and eat them. A consumer is any organism that can obtain nutrients from any other organism. An autotroph is any organism that produces its own food. Most of these are plants, but remember that not all plants are necessarily autotrophs if we consider the pitcher plant. A heterotroph is any organism that needs to eat organic material in order to obtain the nutrients it needs. So, a heterotroph does not produce its own food, it has to acquire it elsewhere. There are some organisms that can be both an autotroph and a heterotroph, but that depends upon the environment. A decomposer is any organism that can break down organic material into its simplest form. A herbivore, otherwise known as a primary consumer, is any organism that only ingests plant material in order to gain the nutrients it needs to survive. So for example, the deer. The secondary consumer is a type of carnivore. It's any organism that will ingest flesh in order to gain the nutrients it needs to survive. Carnivores can also be tertiary consumers, and a tertiary consumer is a consumer that will eat another carnivore. The shark is considered a top carnivore because there are no other carnivores that feed on it. An omnivore is any organism that ingests both plant material and flesh in order to gain the nutrients that they need to survive. For example, the bear will eat other small game like rabbits, but they'll also eat berries. And a decomposer, also known as a saprobe, is any organism that ingests dead organic material in order to gain the nutrients that it needs to survive. These are very important because they recycle materials within our ecosystem.